This presentation, titled Supply Chain Risk Management, Disruption, and Your Opportunities, comes to us from Greg Hutchins. Greg is the founder of Certified Enterprise Risk Manager, SCRM Academy. His company was among the first companies in 1987 to provide audit training with one of the first ISO 9001 certification bodies in North America, AGA Labs, and was first approved by the Department of Homeland Security for critical infrastructure protection, forensics, assurance, analytics. They have been conducting risk audits for 20 years. Greg is the author of the books Value-Added Auditing, Risk-Based Auditing, Supply Chain Risk Management, and ISO 31000 2018. And with that, take it away, Greg.
Thanks, Michael. Again, I want to say thank you for allowing me to give this talk. Thank you, Exemplar Global. Thank you, Mr. Richmond. And thank you, Michelle. I appreciate the opportunity. So what we're going to talk about today is supply chain risk management, disruption, and your opportunities to take advantage of the disruption in a really critical area these days, which is SCRM. I'm going to use SCRM as an acronym for supply chain risk management. Some contact information on the lower left. So a little background. I started auditing, quality auditing, to the predecessor of ISO 9001. In the US, we had MILQ 9858, which eventually became ISO 9001, actually 1987. We did training for the first registrar, North American registrar, AGA, American Gas Association Laboratories in 87, 88, 90. Anyway, I've been in this business a long time. In terms of auditing, the first standard that we used was ISO 10011 that came out in 1990. So I've been in this business a long time. The second point I want to do is go through this entire deck and listen to me, because at the very end, I'm going to show you how you can basically double your salary. Yes, double your salary. So with that inducement, that perk, let's jump into this talk. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about 6 topics. First, I'm going to define supply chain risk management. Then I'm going to talk about today's organizational and management challenges. Then I'm going to talk about trade and supply management disruptions, what today's business and sourcing models are. Then I'm going to talk and basically cover very much in broad detail, 32 strategies for SCRM. And then we're going to finish off with your personal takeaways. And listen to the whole talk, because on the very last slide, we're going to talk about how you can basically double your salary. So let's jump into it. What is SCRM? These are 2 definitions, just 2 of many. The critical point about both of them is the implementation of strategies, not tactics, to manage both everyday and exceptional risks along the supply chain. We want to focus on continuous risk assessment, and the objective is to reduce vulnerability and reduce variability so that there is business continuity. The second definition of SCRM is the coordinated efforts of an enterprise, an organization, to identify, monitor, detect, and mitigate threats to supply chain continuity, and most importantly, profitability. So let's look at what today's management challenges are. One of the gurus of management now is called Ram Charan. And he has this great quote from The Attacker's Advantage. Taking control of uncertainty is a fundamental leadership challenge of our time. Why? Because we're living in VUCA time. VUCA is an acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And especially think about COVID-19. If you go to a store, everything you do seems to be filtered through the lens of risk management. Going to the store, should I wash my hands? Should I bring gloves? What type of mask should I wear? Should I even leave the house, depending upon your age? Should I drive my car? Should I clean everything I touch? Will the food I buy be safe? Anyway, you get the idea. Not only is risk the filter for all management, but risk is really the filter for almost all personal problem solving and decision making. So let's look at this. Most companies now, most countries are focusing on what are we going to do coming out of COVID. Most national policies now focus on jobs. Enterprise companies, threats are much higher due to the coronavirus. The result is companies and countries are reevaluating the future of work, their business models, and we'll talk about this, the make or buy decisions. Every company 20, 30 years ago really had a critical business decision. Should they make a product or buy a product? Buying a product means sourcing it domestically or even sourcing it offshore. Think China. The critical thing is that all business decisions now are made through the risk lens. So let's just look at a couple types of risks that really challenge us, challenge companies, and challenge countries. Climate change, counterfeit products, curtailed shipments of products from offshore, poor internal quality, and even cybersecurity. Now, why is cybersecurity becoming so important? Almost every product we look at has internal smarts. It has software. It has memory. All of that can be hacked. That basically can compromise product quality and service quality if the product is used in a service. So one of the big things now that we're going to look at probably in the next 5 years are smart products such as Internet of Things, or what we would call smart computers and robotics at work. Every one of those can be hacked. If a product can be hacked, it is basically a risky product. So the takeaway is that board and executive management is looking at work, looking at decision making, and looking at the problem solving through the lens of risk. Now let's look at some of the trade and supply issues that are really critical. Just think about it. Can a company, say a US company or an Indian company, withstand loss of parts for a major critical supplier for 4 to 6 months? No, it can't. So what's the solution? Companies now are revisiting business assumptions that they made 20 or 30 years ago. And one of the critical ones is the make or buy decision for each critical source product. Now, if you're purchasing or sourcing commodity items such as fasteners, probably that's not important. But think about it, if it's a fastener for a critical product, that should be basically looked at. Why? Because business continuity a couple of years ago was based on maybe a fire or a work disruption, not a shutdown of an entire economy, such as, or even the global economy being caused by COVID. For example, China shut down for almost a year, so did the US. Many parts of the world are still shut down. So the critical point is that supply chain disruptions are going to be continuous and are going to become much more important for companies. And that's critical for you. ISO auditors, which I hope will become risk ISO auditors, because that's what we're going to talk about, are opportunities for you, job opportunities and salary opportunities. So let's look at what's happening in the US. The trade deficit with China was 419 billion. Then it was reduced 2 years ago to 346, and last year to 283. Why is the deficit being reduced so much? It's because companies are reconfiguring their supply chains. They're looking at the basic fundamental question: should we make the product or should we buy the product? And more companies are saying offshoring to China, offshoring in general, is simply too much of a risk. And that's going to create opportunities for auditors to evaluate their supply chains, evaluate suppliers, evaluate products for risk. Now, is this stuff going to go away? Meaning trade wars? I don't think so. 1 year ago, we would have said that US-China trade differences were negotiable. A year ago, both sides were talking, positioning, posturing, and even negotiating. But now we have a fundamental shift in sourcing strategies that will benefit quality auditors. In some ways, trade and sourcing have been weaponized. You can take a look at the chart on the right and basically see what's happening. In general, the trade with China is being reduced substantially. And what's going to happen is every company is looking at their sourcing strategies. They're looking at their business strategies, their business model, and they're going to change it. They're going to basically look for new suppliers, or they're going to bring products internally. Conducting those type of audits are going to be a huge opportunity for you. And we'll talk about that in the next couple minutes. So here's a jobs metaphor. And this is a metaphor for global trade, but it's also a metaphor for you. Doesn't matter if you're living in China or in India or in Australia or in the US or Canada. The metaphor for global trade can be understood in this one picture that you see on the right. Mai's Bakery is located in Portland, Oregon, in the US. It sells Chinese baked goods, excellent goods. They basically sell a plastic bag to carry your hambao or whatever you're buying. And interestingly, what do they have on their little carry sack? Made in the USA. And we're going to see that throughout the world. Made in India, made in China, made in Brazil, made in Canada. And the point is, jobs are going to be brought back to the home country. We're going to see less global trade. Trade is going to become much more risk-based. And we're going to see many more factories being built. And I believe sourcing is going to become domestic, or it's going to become internal. And those are going to be great opportunities for you because you know product, you know processes, you know quality systems. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So here's an example. Last month in the United States, the US President Biden, came up with a supply chain risk management presidential order. And the basic premise to the order is that pandemics, biological threats, cyber attacks, climate, and extreme weather, terrorist, geopolitical competition is reducing manufacturing capability and capacity. So the president has ordered a complete review of supply chain risks for all critical products purchased by the US government. And the order basically specifies that companies and the government are going to identify gaps in manufacturing, look at single point failures, looking at redundancies, look at potential substitutes of materials, and look at risks, supply chain risks, not only internally in the companies, but externally, such as those created by climate change. Now, interestingly, this type of presidential order we're seeing in other countries, such as China and India, for example. The states, national states now, want to bring production back to their country. Why? Jobs, especially following the COVID pandemic. So in this section, we're going to talk about OEM, original equipment manufacturer, supply chain changes. And we're going to look at their business model changes. In this slide, we're going to talk about how business models have changed, their OEM business models. 10 years ago, we had the changes, we have what's happening on the left, and now we've got new supply chain business models. So 10 years ago, the idea was to manage the brand. Now companies want to, OEMs specifically, want to secure the brand and their IP, intellectual property. 10 years ago, a lot of design was moved offshore. Now companies want to retain design. Why? Because that's the competitive differentiator. 10 years ago, up to 80% of manufacturing was outsourced. Now companies are still outsourcing, but they're reevaluating their make and buy decisions that were made sometimes 10, 20, even 30 years ago. 10 years ago, they would test the products. Now, companies are testing the products internally or using a third-party auditor or supplier to test the products. And of course, companies want to sell the products. Now, In this slide, we're going to look at OEM sourcing models, what they were, say, 10 years ago and what they are now. Now, 10 years ago, most companies, as we saw on the previous slide, would outsource up to 80% of their manufacturing. Now, companies, and by the way, 10 years ago, ISO 9001 certification registration was very important. Now what we're seeing offshore, Vietnam, India, China, Taiwan, is where you've got many more world-class suppliers with IoT or robotics products. 10 years ago, OpEx, operational excellence, practices focused on first article inspection or statistical process control. Now, many manufacturers, offshore as well as domestic, have lean Six Sigma processes that focus on parts per million, defect or nonconformance levels. 10 years ago, technology and design was acceptable. Now, most technology and design is all computerized design, computerized manufacturing, and basically world-class. 10 years ago, quality was measured in terms of CPKs, critical process indices of 1.0, or were compliance oriented. Now, a CPK of 1 basically indicates you've got 3 defects or nonconformances per 1,000. Now, CPKs are 1.33 or parts per million quality level. Delivery 10 years ago was within acceptable windows. Now it's all just in time, or because of the risks, just in case, meaning companies are carrying inventory in process, incoming, or final inventory, again, as a risk measure. Cost maybe 10 years ago was 40% of the buy decision. Now cost is probably 10% or lower of the buy decision. And what's risen in importance is the enterprise risk that the supplier is giving or providing the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer. So let's discuss some sourcing strategies. In this session, we're going to discuss 4 sourcing strategies, and actually we're going to delve into them a little bit deeper. The 4 sourcing strategies we're going to discuss will be accept sourcing risks, diversify them, share them, or control them. The important thing is that in the make or buy decision, each sourcing category should be risk evaluated and risk assessed and mitigated separately. For example, a commodity supplier of a fastener of a non-critical item would be risk evaluated differently than a tech supplier with embedded software. So the first one we're going to discuss is if you're an OEM and you're sourcing products, these are various options that you may have. You may want to reevaluate your business sourcing model. You may want to ask for what we would call bilateral economic concessions. That basically means you're the original equipment manufacturer may be in India or somewhere in Southeast Asia. They're buying products from China, and you essentially say to the Chinese supplier, listen, all of a sudden, Australia, for example, raised tariffs 25%. Are you, supplier, willing to share that risk with me or that cost with me? Another option that the OEM may want to do is to reprice products to domestic customers. In other words, if there's an increased tariff, what do? You reprice the products and make them more dear, more expensive for your customer. You may want to pass along costs along the supply chain to tier 1, tier 2, even tier 3 suppliers. You may want to change your sourcing tolerance. In other words, if risks from that supplier, risks from transportation, risks of product nonconformities increase, what do? You can either accept the risk or change your tolerance. Or another option is to source commodity products from different suppliers. In other words, one supplier means you've got all your eggs in one basket. If you have 2 suppliers, a critical supplier and an alternate approved supplier, then basically you're sharing the risk. You can also insource. Instead of buy, you make the decision to make the product, or Another option you may want to do is game the tariff system, such as transship. And quite frankly, we're seeing a lot of that right now. A product that may be made in China is actually shipped to Vietnam or shipped to Southeast Asia and then transshipped back to the US. That way, the source of the shipment isn't from China. It's actually maybe from Vietnam or Singapore. Another sourcing strategy is to diversify your sourcing risks. Instead of putting all of your eggs in one basket, such as one country or one supplier, you may want to shift your sourcing decisions to alternate countries, perhaps Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, or Indonesia. Another option for the OEM is to develop new supplier risk assurance methods. By the way, as you go through the list, you as quality auditors, you as ISO management systems auditors should realize that if a company is going to change its business model, if it's going to change its sourcing strategy, you're in the catbird seat. In other words, you're professionally very well positioned to work with a company to come up with new suppliers, new products, and new assurance methods. So let's look at diversifying sourcing risks. You can develop new assurance methods, develop multiple sourcing options. One of the options that the OEM may want to do is come up with a prime domestic supplier and an acceptable offshore alternative. Many companies now, for example, are rethinking China and finding new suppliers in India, Vietnam, Indonesia. You may want to make the product in-house. Also, you may want to decide, instead of not using just in time, using just in case. For example, think of what happened with that ship that was stuck in the Suez Canal. A lot of companies having a very lean and just-in-time sourcing methodology got stuck. They didn't have product in the warehouse. They didn't have product, incoming product. They didn't have product. So the result was factories were closed throughout the world. Why? Because one ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. And of course, the option is to carry additional buffer inventories, buffer in terms of incoming, in process, and final inventories. Another strategy is to share sourcing risks. Share tariffs with the OEM and first tier. You can also cascade the cost to second, third tier suppliers. You can buy disruption insurance. You can bring your design in-house, impose higher product and cost requirements, retain single acceptable alternate suppliers, source in multiple countries, and add further requirements onto the supplier. The critical item here is that almost every one of these bullets integrates auditors or requires auditors. In other words, sourcing is moving to risk, ISO is moving to risk, and that's going to create lots of job opportunities for you. So hang on, because in about 5 minutes, I'm going to share with you how you can double your salary and actually prove it. Another strategy that's being used is to control sourcing risks. And a couple of these we've already discussed. You can reevaluate your make or buy. You can reevaluate suppliers based on risk. You can add additional supplier controls. You can conduct forensic supplier audits. And you can add Internet of Things product testing, reliability, software. There are other things you can do to ensure that you monitor the shipment from where it's made to where it's finally delivered. Other options in terms of controlling sourcing risk is I add IP agreements, intellectual property agreements with your suppliers, obtain source code for embedded software, push OEM requirements to sub-tier suppliers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. You can ensure product traceability of suppliers by using blockchain and various other strategies. And then you can provide a chain of assurance and risk controls to the OEM. Again, all of these are opportunities to enhance your career, make more money as a quality auditor. So in the final session, we're going to talk about your takeaways from this presentation. And bear with me just for a couple more minutes, and I'll share with you how you can basically make more money. So let's look at your takeaways from this talk. Business models and SCRM are changing. What we have here is a lot of uncharted territory for companies and for quality auditors. Coronavirus is an unexpected event. The political, business, and people changes from COVID are going to have some unintended consequences. Because of COVID, we really don't have a vocabulary yet, or even a taxonomy for what's happening to business and supply chains. In other words, all rules of business, all rules of engagement with suppliers are changing. And rules and norms are going to change. The bottom line is, following COVID, we don't know what we don't know. But I'm going to share with you some lessons learned. Some takeaways. Risk, I think, is becoming the language of the board and executive management. Risk is the lens for critical management, problem solving, and critical decision making. In other words, I think we can safely say that management now is all about risk management. And supply management now is all about supply chain risk management. Now, here's the opportunity for you. One of your takeaways. The board and executive management want operational and supply chain risk control information. You, the quality auditor, you, the operational business auditor, are hugely well positioned to take advantage of that. And quality is going to become much more important. Another takeaway from this presentation is that SCRM, supply chain risk management auditing, is going to become more important. Let me give you a couple examples. Risk now is being integrated into all ISO standards. So let me take a sidebar a second. In auditing, there are three critical questions that we need to look at: who, what, and how. And I'll give you an example. ISO 9001 is the what of auditing. In other words, ISO 9001 and the other standards say, what are you going to check adherence against? What are you going to audit to? The how basically is ISO 19011-2018. It basically says that all management systems are going to be risk-based audited. It's the common standard for planning, conducting, and reporting audits. If you haven't bought ISO 19011-2018, it's about 47 pages. It's all about risk-based auditing. Now, interestingly, ISO 19011 is the how. The original how, ISO 10011 was actually developed in 1990. That standard was only 7 pages long, maybe even 6. The new standard, ISO 19011-2018, is 47 pages. Buy the standard. Learn how to basically plan, conduct, and report a quality audit. Why? What's in it for you? Well, quality auditors are going to evolve into risk and assurance auditors. That means quality auditing requirements are going to increase. And again, this is really going to put quality in the catbird seat in the future. Now, some personal objectives. We're going to talk in this slide and the next slide. What's in it for you? We believe the future of quality is going to be risk. Risk in terms of management problem solving and in terms of decision making. Learn risk management. It's going to be your future. Learn risk-based auditing, especially right now if you're a management systems auditor. In the next slide, we'll basically give you the punchline, why it's important for you. Get ISO 19011, learn value-added auditing, and then especially learn how to conduct risk-based supplier audits. This whole talk has been basically how Companies are changing, their business models are changing. How we're going to bring jobs back into India, into China. All OEMs are going to reevaluate their make or buy decision. And I think a lot of companies are going to lower the risk or their enterprise risk by bringing manufacturing back to their home country. Why? High paid jobs. So it's incumbent upon you to help your company manage suppliers, choose suppliers, make them better. And how do you do that? Through supply chain risk management. Then finally, what we recommend is learn how to architect, design, deploy, and assure SCRM control systems. Then finally, the punchline. Why should you care? Last week, I gave a talk to CQI, Chartered Quality Institute in the UK. And they basically have IRCA auditors. And this is a slide that I showed them. Quality assurance auditors in general in the UK, United Kingdom, make £29,000 per year. Risk-based auditors or internal auditors in the United Kingdom almost make twice as much, £51,000. Those numbers, by the way, you can find in the United States, Canada, throughout the world. Quality assurance is X. If you do risk-based auditing, which is what internal auditors do, they make essentially twice as much. So here's the takeaway for you. Learn risk-based auditing. Learn how to risk plan, risk conduct, and risk report your audits. If you can do that within 2 years, regardless of the country, you're going to basically double your salary. So I want to say thank you for Exemplar Global. If you're interested in how to basically risk manage your suppliers, if you're interested in how to conduct risk-based audits, there are a couple of books that we've written on the right. Anyway, I want to say thank you very much for attending this talk. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me or Mike Richmond. Thank you very much for watching, and that's it.
Well, thank you, Greg Hutchins, for that look at SCRM auditing, and that concludes this presentation.